Welcome, welcome everybody. Let me introduce Ed Ayers first, and then we're going to conduct, in essence, a conversation about this new book and about other issues. I told you I was going to ask you about monuments, didn't I?
You
right,
did.
okay. I hope I did. Anyway, this is a real honor for me. I've known Ed a long time, and I don't think we've ever really we hosted you here for a special kind of private event where we were trying to plan a couple of years ago what to do at the Gilder Lehrman Center about things digital, and Ed is a true pioneer of things digital, so he came and instructed us on what to do, and now of course we're obviously failing at things digital. But not because of you, Daniel, not to worry. Well, Ed Ayers was born in East Tennessee.
That's going to be a long introduction.
No, it's going to get quicker.
Oh, okay.
Wow, all right. Hey, we're up and running.
What town was that?
I forgot, actually. What town was it?
It was Asheville, North Carolina, actually. Then we moved over the state
Oh, you
line.
moved over the mountains, that's right. All right, Asheville moved over the mountains. Went to the University of Tennessee, then came here, did his PhD with David Bryan Davis in 1980, and then went to teach at the University of Virginia and taught for many years at UVA, where he then also became dean for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years at least. Then he moved to the University of Richmond, where he was president until just, is it 2 years ago or 2 years ago? He allegedly retired, which isn't really true, and is now the Tucker Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and University Professor and President Emeritus of the University of Richmond. Ed is, I'm going to mention a few books in a moment, but Ed is a pioneer, as we just said, of digital history. The Valley of the Shadow project here, I mean, I'm not much of a digital historian, but it was the first one I ever kind of looked at, the first one I ever taught with, or stole from, borrowed from.
It was all a gift, David.
Thank you, thank you. This is payback. And that project is still located at the University of Virginia and is now run by former assistants, I guess. Ed is also a founder and creator of the NPR program Backstory, and still one of the hosts of Backstory. If you haven't heard any of Backstory, you should. He's
with
also
your colleague, Joanne Freeman.
and John Freeman is now one of your
And
hosts.
we're a podcast, by the way, so just to...
Oh, your podcast.
yeah,
Sorry
so,
about
so
that.
they could download them all
While they're
when you
listening
get to
to
my
us.
my
Okay.
adolescence.
Oh, okay. I'm past your adolescence. Come on,
Okay.
come on. Well, anyway, but look, I've known Ed too as a public historian. He helped run a project in Richmond called The Future of Richmond's Past, a town with ground zero of Civil War public history, a town that always has a Civil War problem. He's also been a board member and chairman of the board of the National Civil War Center at Tredegar, a board I'm also on, but I never get to the meetings anymore, so don't chastise me. Okay. And a host of other things that Ed has done as a public historian, hinder and yon. Let me mention just a few of the books. His first book, which was his dissertation here under DBD, was Vengeance and Justice, Crime and Punishment in 19th Century American South. The Promise of the New South, that great rewriting of the history of the New South. Life After Reconstruction, which was a finalist for both Pulitzer and National Book Award. Then the CD-ROM project, Valley of the Shadow, which was both remember CD-ROMs? CD-ROM and book, which he co-authored with Ann Rubin. In the Presence of Mine Enemies, the first book of this now 2-volume work on the Valley of the Shadow, or the two regions, the two towns and regions, one in Virginia, one in Pennsylvania. Presence of Mine Enemies won the Bancroft, among other prizes. I was actually on the jury that year, so you owe me one too.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was on the jury that year and voted for it.
Thank you.
Anyway, but there's so many other books, edited books, books that came out of the Civil War sesquicentennial, which Ed was deeply involved in. In fact, a quick anecdote. The first gathering in Virginia gave more resources and more attention to the Civil War sesquicentennial than any other state. And the first gathering they held was in 2009, anniversary of John Brown's raid. It was held at the University of Richmond in their basketball arena with like, I don't know, 5,000 people attending, jumbotrons, and Ed was the impresario who chaired, moderated, and pulled all of that off. And here was the cool part. He insisted, and that was 4 panels, or
Yeah,
I don't know, 4 panels. I was on the John Brown one, I think. But all of us historians on these panels had to speak as though we knew nothing that had ever happened after 1859. We were supposed to not be historians and historians. And every time we ventured ahead, or if anybody even mentioned something historiographical, he just shut us up. He just like closed the door. Said, no, you don't know that. You know. And damned if it didn't work. The audience kind of loved it. But today we're going to be historians. Fear not. Anyway, and finally, the new book, The Thin Light of Freedom, The Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America, is now the second volume, as I said, of this 2-volume work. The first came out, was it just before you became president at Richmond?
But no, it was, my second year as Dean of Arts and Sciences at Virginia.
You were still at UVA, okay. And he wandered off to become college president, gets out of the presidency, and the second book comes out. This is the study of 2 communities we'll begin now to talk about. Staunton, Virginia, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Franklin County in Pennsylvania, Augusta County in Virginia, 200 miles apart.
I can
2
show a
communities.
map very quickly
Let's
from
go,
this, since
do the
we've
math.
got it fired up.
2 communities that went to war, savage war, against each other, out of which Ed and his team developed a deep social, military, cultural, political history database, and out of which came these 2 books. There we are. Go ahead. Tell us about this project a little. Tell us about where we are now before we get into what you've written.
So it's 1991. Hello, everybody. It's good to be back to the place that gave me most of the opportunities in my life. It's really to be here. The idea was, wouldn't it be great if people who weren't fortunate enough to be at a place with a research library could actually see what history looked like? If the history didn't have to come to you double, column, shrink wrap, with multiple choice tests at the end, but you could explore it. And 600 people at a time could be invited to, hey, what caused the Civil War? 10,000 pages of newspaper, every census record, every letter, every diary, every military record, every church record, and organized so that you could find your way in it, but not so organized as we told you what to think. For any of the digital geeks in the room, I'm very proud. This is the only proprietary piece of software in the Valley of the Shadow. It's a flash map from 1999. And it's pretty cool. We can choose one unit. And this is each little explosion is tied to a database and all this. So when we began this, within 6 months of the web's existence, PDF files didn't exist. So we had to make up how to do all of this. And so nobody would do it today because they would know how hard it was. We were protected by innocence and didn't really know what we were getting into. But the good news is they pumped a lot of money into the graduate program at Virginia, and they actually helped a lot of young scholars become digital historians in their own right and get jobs and do cool projects on their own. But one reason I became dean is that I was trying to figure out how to continue to sustain this, and so I basically gave blood. I said, yes, I'll become dean of arts and sciences if you'll put X amount of money into this every year, and so we did that. So this gives you an idea. This is one unit, and this gives you one reason why I chose these 2 counties somewhat cruelly, because they are involved in every major battle in the Eastern Theater. But I also chose them because they both had 2 newspapers all the way through the war, and so we could hear what the Democrats and Republicans are saying, and former secessionists and former Unionists. And then sometimes I just lucked out. The largest collection of African-American soldiers from one family happened to be from Franklin County. The only diary in which a husband and wife keep parallel diaries for the entire war happens to be there, and other diaries and things that are remarkable. So it's where John Brown and Frederick Douglass met before Harper's Ferry. I Pennsylvania. So that just shows you what careful planning can do.
Well, indeed. In fact, you chose these counties for lots of reasons, but they both are windows into the much, much larger story. And this is a book, if you haven't read it, if you've read the first one, you know contours of it, the assumptions of it, and so on. This one is very similar, although there are a few differences. It's very much a local story and a national story at the same time.
Yeah, what's weird, as my favorite academic word, counterintuitive about it, is that you're going to choose two places that are that close to each other and not really the South and not really the North. Why aren't you doing Massachusetts and South Carolina? Because we know the Civil War was really a struggle between industrial and agrarian, or between two different cultures or two different economies. What are you doing choosing places that are only 200 miles apart? And that was part of it, to show us that it's slavery. That is the difference. There's that one line on the ground. On one side is slavery, the other side is not. Otherwise, the same religions, the same ethnicities, the same soil, the same climate, the same products. And yet, and here was the question of the whole project, how could Americans sharing everything grow to hate each other enough in 6 months to kill each other for 4 years? To the tune of, if the Civil War happened today, it would be the equivalent of 8 million people dying. Okay, most of the usual stories we have about where wars came from just don't fit the United States. People tend to forget that Virginia is the largest slave state, even though it goes into the Confederacy with great reluctance. And Pennsylvania is literally, to coin a phrase, almost a keystone of the North, that it's absolutely central to the political future of the United States. So, but it turns out I chose them because they were near the border, but choosing two places near the border actually ends up emphasizing what drove the Civil War, and it was not a lot of the things that we've told ourselves.
Can I ask you about your assumptions?
Yes, you may.
May I? Okay. I made a list in going through your book today of what seemed to me 4 or 5 assumptions that drive your book, and you tell me if I'm wrong, and we'll ignore it, and if I'm right, you can explain them.
Okay.
How about that? The first is that nothing's inevitable to the people who experience this. Nothing. I mean,
that's right. And why?
Reflect.
You know, it's not so much an assumption as it is fighting against really the most entrenched beliefs that we teach our children, that are built in our textbooks, that are in folk knowledge about the war. And it has lots of different faces, as you've written about. There's the Robert Penn Warren here, the great treasury of virtue. Americans who are not white Southerners imagine, well, of course the United States was going to rise up and destroy the slavery with which it had lived for 250 years. And of course, when it did, it would win, because it's truth and justice, as well as a lot more men and stuff. And then once you know that's how the story comes out, you just go back and look for all the ways that it really began at the time of the Constitution. It was just hardwired in. And so I rubbed against the grain of all that, A, because it's not true, and B, because it allows us to understand each moment for itself, rather than just a bead on a string that we already know what it's going to look like. And in Volume 1, I called it Deep Contingency, unless that's going to be...
Yeah, I know you didn't repeat that.
Yeah.
Is that because too many graduate seminars fussed over it or something?
No, it's because I didn't want to look like I only had one idea in my life, you know. But I think that I wrote a long footnote about it, then my editor said, you know, you don't really need that. And so I took it out and said, now you're the second person who's brought it up in 2 days, so thanks a lot.
Oh, dear.
But
no, you brought it up.
Yeah, I know. But the point being is that it sounds banal to say nothing's inevitable, but in the case of the Civil War, people know that individual events aren't inevitable. What I argue is as late as 1864, the outcome of the war is not inevitable, and the consequence of ending slavery is not inevitable. And that has moral meaning. And so I don't know what your other 4 are. I can talk indefinitely about that one.
Maybe
just
1
pause.
or 2 more.
Okay.
How about events often change people more than their ideology?
Yeah. I think that part of our thinking that the Civil War is sort of hardwired into American history. You know, Ken Burns talked about in his series is the adolescent crisis of America. It was bound to happen. And America had to go through it to become itself. was the argument. But you see this in a lot of other and more scholarly representations of the war as well. And why is that? It's because Northerners and Southerners supposedly have different ideologies for different reasons. One, maybe religion. Two, maybe sort of means of production, all these kinds of things. What's scary, as it turns out, is how adaptable slavery was and how adaptable people were to slavery and how they could wrap so many of their ideas around it. So what it turns out, so Augusta County is the most unionist county in Virginia before the Civil War. They vote against secession to the very last vote. They go down, and then the next day they say, okay, well, we're Confederates now. And they die and fight more than most of the counties in the South. And in March of 1865, 3 weeks before Appomattox, they say, we were right. God has willed this, and we have no injustice, we have no beliefs. So if it's their ideology, what ideology is that? Yeah. Okay? Yeah. They transferred all their loyalty as one piece to an entirely new nation fighting against the United States. And so they have deep beliefs, they have deeply patterned objects of faith and so forth, but it turns out that the objects of those loyalties can shift overnight.
That March, there's an event, more than an anecdote in the new book, that March 1865 meeting they have in the town square in Augusta, where they make, I mean, the war's only got another 2 weeks to go, right. 3 weeks to go, and they have this incredible public meeting where they make these speeches about keep dying, die till the last moment. I mean, it's really hard to believe they're still arguing this. And the
sentence that gets me is that should President Davis and General Lee ask for it, we shall surrender our slaves as we have our sons. Yeah. It seems like a strange order to have surrendered things, but that gives you a lot. Yeah. But what that means is, and I use this when I'm speaking out in public more, that means that the Confederacy never did enlist large numbers of African American men in any formal sense. No. The fact that they're still at the end talking about doing it gives us some sense that that was still an eventuality.
I'm going to save the third assumption for the end because that's kind of where it belongs. This thing called the Confederacy.
Yeah.
What was it? What should we call it? What's the category for it? We have a class here this term by one of my students. What are you calling it? The Confederate Experiment. Yes. Wildly popular seminar. Good timing, by the way. What was the Confederacy? What should it be called?
You know, it's hard, and I resent you bringing it up because, our friend Steve Hahn says we shouldn't honor it with a name. So he says no other nation ever recognized the Confederacy. Why should we? And Lincoln and Andrew Johnson.
But I didn't say that. Steve did.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And Abraham Lincoln refuses to ever just call it the Confederacy. He says the so-called Confederacy. I think that's as good a name as any because they call themselves a Confederacy. Many hundreds of thousands of people die for it, believe in it. If it had won, it would have changed world history. I don't think that just refusing to call it by its name actually serves the purposes we need for that. So it's a would-be nation. And the striking thing about this nation, one reason it shows such durability in memory and in statuary, is that it never existed without war. It was mobilized, driven, organized, focused on war, and
crushed in war.
Yes. But what people remember is that they gave everything they had to it. And so if you want to equate a would-be nation with the most fervent kind of patriotism that is only death and sacrifice and loss, the Confederacy really concentrates it all.
And you found that great quote passage, which you use as a chapter title from the Franklin newspaper, one of the Republican Franklin newspaper, called the Confederacy the colossal suicide of world history.
Yeah. Well, and that is...
Can't make that up.
I don't know if you wrote the text for the poster, but I thought it was really good where you talked about the oppositional politics and stuff.
Did I write that? I think I did.
But it's very good. Are we going to talk about that, or is this time for me to bring that up?
Go ahead. I'm taking you to partisanship and politics next. So
well, here's the thing. How in the world, and this is the two things about events and non-inevitability, how in the world could the largest, most powerful slave society of the modern world end in 4 years? And then how, with no compensation for the slaveholders, with no transition period, and then be followed by the boldest effort to install a new constitutional order that made at least the males of that formerly enslaved population voting citizens, writing new constitutions. That's all impossible. The Civil War and Emancipation and Reconstruction could not have happened by the calculation of anybody at the time, including Abraham Lincoln. Maybe Frederick Douglass could have seen it. I'm willing to believe that he saw things. But
He wished.
yeah, exactly. And so how could it happen? Well, the main players in at least allowing it to happen are the Confederates. If you do not secede, there is no way that slavery can be destroyed. Lincoln says, as he takes office, we believe if we constrain slavery and it does not expand, it will die in about 5 generations, about 1960. Because it's constitutionally protected where it is. It cannot be uprooted. The only way that slavery could have been destroyed is if the South succeeded by seceding and taking it out of constitutional protection. Then the South permits emancipation by fighting long enough for the advocates of emancipation in the North to mobilize sufficient electoral power to, and it's not just Abraham Lincoln. We've kind of descended into is Lincoln's personality. That's not really what the issue is here. If he cannot mobilize his own party to fully support the uncompensated immediate end of slavery, it doesn't happen. Sometimes when I'm trying to tweak people down south, I will say Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are responsible for emancipation. Because if they had allowed Richmond to fall in the summer of 1862, the end of slavery had not been declared as a Union purpose by that point. If the South had just lost, and then it would have had a different outcome. So then, this comes up again later, but I will just talk about that. But that is the thing to understand. I mean, the whole premise of this entire project and of both books is what if we put everybody in the same frame? What if we put black people and white people, free and enslaved, northern and southern, men and women, Republicans and Democrats, soldiers and civilians, in the same frame of analysis, rather than titrating different groups out apart and analyzing them and
Which is the way you write the book. It's constantly in dialogue.
Exactly, which just makes it hard. But once you get organized, it's okay. But that's the whole idea of the whole thing. And that grew out of being here in the heyday of the new social history and a democratic impulse. And I was here for the 3 days that we thought quantitative history was a good idea. But the idea there, the democratic idea, and this is where the Valley of the Shadow comes from, it would be good if we did everything we could to include everybody in the story, even if all they left was a single line in a bill of sale or in a casualty report. If we could put those into a common frame and see the story where the people are making each other's history, it would all look different. And here's a case where if you, instead of just focusing on what's Abraham Lincoln thinking, what the Confederates are doing, and what the enslaved people are doing, who take the first step toward all this, as we know. So the colossal suicide of world history, I thought that was such a great line, and they say it at the time, and Confederates recognize it. But they go, what have we done? What have we brought down on ourselves? This was completely of our own making. That's part of this lost cause thing. You have to figure out, how do we explain what we did? It must have been,
live with it.
It must have been honor.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Can you talk a little bit about the sheer depth of partisanship
I can.
of these two communities? Well, I guess particularly Franklin County in Pennsylvania, the way the Democrats and Republicans just savage each other. We think we've got partisanship.
Yeah.
I mean, we do, but
That's right. Well,
they had it in the middle of the Civil War.
There's quite a few parallels. So Franklin County in 1860 votes for Abraham Lincoln in exactly the same proportion as the North as a whole, 56%. But the Democrats never go away, and they are critiquing every single thing the Republicans and Lincoln say and do at every step. Things that we consider sort of sacred creed now. They make fun of the second inaugural, like Hey, God hasn't made up his mind. When he does, I guess we'll have to accept it.
Right.
That's their paraphrase of the
They do
second.
parodies of the Second Inaugural.
You're right. And the Gettysburg Address, and they say
They're
every speech he ever gives that they ridicule. And so here's the fact, and I think this may be the most pivotal argument of the book, is that if there's a turning point in the Civil War, it's not a battle. It's the election of 1864. And most of the battles are actually pointed at that election. And there's a quote in the book. The guy says, if we lose a battle, there's another one. If we lose this election, we've lost everything. And in that election, Abraham Lincoln is able to persuade almost no white Democrats to support him who had not supported him before. In the greatest crisis of the nation, 48% of white Northern men will not support Abraham freaking Lincoln. Okay? Now, we're used to thinking about Roosevelt and then World War II, and okay, let's put this partisan stuff aside. In the greatest crisis of the nation, the Democrats doubled down and refused to do that. I argue that that's actually, so some people have argued that the North has partisan conflict while the South doesn't. The South was just as partisan, just as divided before the war, but they changed the Constitution in two ways. One, they frankly acknowledged slavery, actually using the S word, and they put a 6-year term in for the president. So the Confederacy never has a presidential election.
And they didn't really have parties.
Well, that's what they subordinate them. They come roaring back. So
They do come roaring back.
But during the war, you're not supposed to be partisan. You can be petty and squabble, but not doing all that. So much of the Confederate, or so-called Confederate, the Confederate experiment effort, and Lee says this when he invades Pennsylvania. He tells his wife, I want to show the Yankee nation that their leadership is a failure. They cannot protect them. After 2 years of war and sacrifice, we can walk right into the back door of the United States. And everything they're doing is trying to get,
No, go ahead.
all the South has to do to win is for the North to decide they've sacrificed enough of their sons and brothers. Okay? That's all. The South has to absorb enough blows for the North to give up. And they think that's not just going to happen in general, that will happen in an election.
Right.
And the fact that they are nearly right. Here's the fact that echoes today. If 80,000 men in 3 different states had voted differently, George McClellan would have won in 1864.
Well, that's like Hillary, 60,000 votes in 3 states.
Yeah, exactly. And now, so we look, and this goes back to your first points about inevitability and events.
Yeah.
When we teach it in the schools, our textbooks show the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And hey, look, Abraham
Landslide.
Lincoln, yeah, he's got it. And he does, and that's when the Electoral College does what it's supposed to. It created a mandate for this great and good thing of the 13th Amendment and Reconstruction out of what is in fact a very close election.
Yeah.
And I do think we've seen in recent years that the 48% of people who don't vote for you and hate you are still a potent force afterwards. And I think our stories of the Civil War just really haven't dealt with that very much.
Well, and even after the Gettysburg campaign, the retreat back into Virginia for Lee's army, the hope was still in part based on the election of 64. If they could hold out, you show that here.
Right.
I mean, others have shown it, but you really vividly show it on the ground. The hope for the Confederates is they could hold out for the election of 64 and the North will tear itself apart.
Yeah, and I think this is a place where the book's a little divided. I'll be curious to see what political historians and military historians think about this. So the Democrats wait as late as they can in the summer of 64 to have their convention. They're waiting for the war just to go as badly as possible so that they can harness that, right? And so they finally get together in August and nominate McClellan. He writes kind of a weird letter back, and he kind of accepts it. But by the time they get home, Atlanta has fallen to Sherman. And I can tell you that in almost every account of the war, that is seen as the turning point. Well, that leaves a problem of Robert E. Lee is still 150 miles from the capital of the United States, and in July, Jubal Early is right on the Beltway, right on the edge of Washington, and they burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And So it's then, and the Shenandoah Valley has been the great, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. There's a rail line that runs from Augusta County to Richmond, down here where this is. And it goes through the longest railroad tunnel in the world at the time that had just recently been dug by enslaved people and Irish people. And if they can keep that railroad line running from the Shenandoah Valley to Richmond and Lee's army in Petersburg, Lee can keep fighting. So Grant, as a part of the Overland campaign, says, we're finally going to clear out the valley. I won't ruin the story for you, but it takes all summer long, 3 distinct campaigns. But finally, he puts Sheridan in charge and says, here's 35,000 men. Take the valley. Actually, get that railroad, which he never does. This is after they burn Chambersburg to the ground. Sheridan comes down and then burns the productive capacity of the Shenandoah Valley. That's in October of 1864.
Right before the election.
Before the election, and the march, Sherman's march does not happen until after the election. So if there is a vote in the United States on how much war Americans should inflict on each other to destroy entire farms and barns and take away all the food for all these people, it's the Valley and Sheridan that do it. And what happens? He becomes the big hero of the North. And we all know, people talk about an October surprise. I think this is the ultimate October surprise. Because otherwise, okay, we have surrendered all these men, all this money, you've had this advantage, and you cannot drive what everybody recognizes is the most powerful Southern Army and its greatest general. With every force that you have, you still cannot do it. We can imagine that could have made that difference that would have won the election. So that's another way that I was fortunate, that things were so unfortunate in the places that I studied that I think it actually matters.
Well, there's also some great environmental history in this book without you stopping to call it that.
Right.
The sheer ravaging of this land, this gorgeous, fecund landscapes, these landscapes that just get ravaged over and over. You refer to the armies as descending like storms. Yeah. An army is like a storm hitting wherever it went. Just leveled forest. It stole 60,000 cows they take out of southern Pennsylvania in
2 weeks.
In 2 weeks in the Gettysburg campaign. I mean, Lee's army is just stealing all the cows. Who would have thought there were 60,000 cows in southern Pennsylvania? I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is environmental history in many ways, and you'll see references to by 1864 when they burn the valley, Lee's soldiers have 1,000 calories a day, and 2,000 is what you need for an adult man to survive. But their horses are starving to death, you know? And so one reason they invade Pennsylvania is for environmental reasons. Hunger. And also to get they know their own army is almost as devastating to the local landscape as the enemy army. And so they're just trying to get everybody out of Virginia during the growing season. So yeah, I do that, and history of disease and all those kinds of things. So I wish there had been fewer than 14 years between the 2 volumes. But on the other hand, I was able to harvest, so to speak, a lot of great work on all the subjects that I deal with. The secondary work, I don't think I would have thought about the environment in the same way, and I don't think that I would have. And we've obviously learned so much about, the way enslaved people confronted these moments in Reconstruction. So maybe it's just in the same way I chose these 2 counties and it worked out for the best. Maybe it's for the best that I was actually at cocktail parties for 14 years instead of writing this book.
I once asked Ed, we were in an airport somewhere. I said, what's your biggest problem being president of the University of Richmond? His answer was, LaGuardia. Which I thought was a great answer. Anyway, that's a bad anecdote.
My joke was that I've become an hors d'oeuvre. I just sort of lived on tonic water and lime and the least greasy hors d'oeuvre that I could find. So
okay, I got 1,000 questions here. A few more. Lee, we were treated a couple weeks ago to a statement by the president's chief of staff, which caused us endless media requests.
You were great.
Well,
I believe all the exclamation points in your responses.
No. But anyway, Lee, what's your brief take on Lee? As general, as person, as man, whatever, What do you say?
Let me here's what I say. So I'm on the commission to decide what we're going to do with all the monuments in Richmond. And we're having many meetings. And actually, we already received 1,200 letters and emails, many of which actually have thoughtful approaches. I'm trying to think of some creative approach to it rather than think of it as a chess game with so many pieces of this and so many pieces of that. I'm inspired by, the Vietnam Memorial. A lot of people died, and a lot of people have been in slavery for a long time and became free. Where are those statues? Why is it always somebody on a horseback? And it's not an accident. And so what I have to tell people, they always want to talk about, as Kelly did, what Lee's motivation was. And apparently it's okay to abandon your oath to the United States if you're defending what you imagine to be your home state. And that's sort of the story that we have. There's one of my favorite quotes in here. Do you remember this when Lee dies?
Oh, yeah.
And the Northern newspaper says, so all the other newspapers, and certainly in the South, a lot in the North, are bordered by big black funereal boundaries. And this Republican paper says,
It's only 1870.
1870, says, Lee is responsible for almost all the deaths in the horrible last year of the war, because he could have gone to Davis and said, we cannot win this war. Let's don't have the Battle of the Crater. Let's don't have the Cold Harbor, and that he didn't give up his commission to the United States until he'd learned the plans of the North. And after the war was over, he sat there like a disgruntled old man and just didn't say anything. He was praised for holding his peace, but he could have done more to put the country back together than anybody. And they say, let his bones rest in the ground. No more words need to be said. And it's so interesting how that entire view just disappears in time. That's right.
It's great. But part of the Lee myth is that supposedly he was the reconciler after the war.
Yeah, I know. But he wasn't.
No, I know. But you can't kill that idea.
Yeah,
You just can't kill it.
Well, here's the phrase that I have about that. Everybody wants to talk about Lee, and no matter what else you do, Ed, you can't do anything with the Lee statue and so forth. Other people might have had different motivations, but Robert E. Lee was great. And I said, let's forget about what motivated him to abandon his oath to the United States. What if he and Jackson and Stewart and Davis had won? You would have had the fourth richest economy in the world based on perpetual bondage, with a monopoly over the single most valuable commodity in the world, with its eyes already on Cuba and Mexico and Central America. So let's forget about the motivations of Robert E. Lee and whether or not he valued his family, whatever, over that. Let's think about what if they had won. And people go, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Appomattox. What about
We're in the lightning round. All right.
No, that's right. No, Appomattox. It's again, talk about mythology. And what does Appomattox mean, and how did it get misinterpreted and misused? I memean, in the aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, and it's all a part.
That's where the surrender happened, for those not informed.
Of all, against your first two assumptions, that nothing's inevitable and that the events are creating things. Most of and the framing of the book is weird. It's also, as we told you, I finished volume 1 as I was dean, and I called my editor. I said, I probably not have much time to work on this anymore. I've got 500 pages, and people who've read it said it looks kind of like a book, and it goes from John Brown's raid to the day before Gettysburg. That sounds plausible. Or you can wait an indefinite period, and I'll give you 1,000 pages. He said, let's see what you have now. And so we published half a book in 2003. So it picks up in Gettysburg, but goes then to the 15th Amendment. End of Reconstruction, it's creativity, right? And so the whole point of that is to not start and stop at Appomattox, or frankly the Emancipation Proclamation either. Appomattox basically in our national imagination is, hey, good game. Yeah. Let's go, take your horses, you take your gun, let's get out of there. And but the fact is, and people are congratulating Americans, we didn't have guerrilla war afterwards, like all those less civilized countries, unless you consider the Ku Klux Klan and decades of white terror against black people as guerrilla war, which it is. So I think that Elizabeth Varyn wrote a great book about this and just points out that Grant said, I take this to mean that we won morally as well as militarily, and that you are now coming into a United States that's been reimagined. Robert E. Lee says, you guys had more stuff, you outnumbered us, you beat us on the battlefield, but we regret nothing. The seeds of all that followed were planted there, and it's people heard what they wanted to hear out of both those speeches.
It's a surrender, not a peace treaty.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
I mean, I think you show that beautifully. Well, I got many other questions. I'm going to open it up to you in just a moment. You follow different characters and people throughout the book. So I want you to talk a little bit about the writing of this, getting all these voices in together. The black folks from Franklin County, the number of black soldiers who actually, many of whom ended up in the 54th Massachusetts, the famous Massachusetts Regiment. There's a whole section in a cemetery there now, which is the dead of the 54th Mass in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania.
The second largest per capita enlistment in the USCT.
And there are a lot of letters
Pennsylvania.
that you uncovered
Yeah.
by these people. Plus, then there's the whole story of all the black folk, free and former fugitives that Lee's army kidnapped during the Gettysburg campaign. That had been done before, but you got a lot of examples in it. Anyway, you got a lot of voices, you got key characters, many of whom survive all the way through. So how did you think about doing that? Well, I got one Confederate, I got one Unionist, and by the way, one other thing. You almost never use the word Unionist. You say it's the United States.
Yeah.
So think about,
Why?
yeah.
Well, that goes back to your first question about the Confederacy. Whatever the Confederacy was, it was the United States that was fighting them. It's not like that Unionist and Confederate, like those are equivalent.
Yeah.
It's kind of the Appomattox syndrome.
Right.
No, it's the United States fighting against a rebellion.
He says when Lee invades Pennsylvania, he's invading the United States. Okay, well, we don't usually talk about it that way. Anyway.
Yeah,
go
Lincoln
ahead.
was driven crazy when Meade says, we've driven the foe from our soil. And Lincoln says, it's all our soil.
Right.
What are you talking about?
So how do you conceive writing this as this kind of multivocal social, military, political history? How do you do it?
You know, so I wrote volume 1, starting it at Stanford, a year at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. And I sat down with this website and said, all right, I've got the Annals School in motion, okay? and I, which is really the way I was thinking about this, got all this depth. And I wrote like 150 pages, and I had gone 2 weeks because storms are brewing, the roads, you know, it's like every detail that I could do. And I looked at this, and I thought, well, at this rate, I'm writing Encyclopedia Britannica. I just started all over again and said, okay, what's this book about? This book is about slavery and war. This book is about war and emancipation, okay? So if it's not about those things, then no matter how great the detail is, I'm not going to put it in there. So the book feels like it's got lots of stuff in it, and it does, but it's all about those two stories.
Okay.
And
they all come back to those two stories.
right, there's sort of the gravitational pull in those two.
Amazing how many key people lived in those two counties.
Isn't it? I know, it is. It is really the head of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's right.
The people who figure
Thaddeus
out,
Stevens.
but also the people who figure out how to get Virginia back into the United States.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
they just happen to be from my county. It's amazing. So then the idea became sort of, I think of as steps. We move forward one step at a time chronologically, because if events matter, a day matters, an hour matters, time matters. So the trick was not letting any good quote from a diary from 2 months later be used before its time, because they couldn't really have known that. So it's north and then south, and then I have the italics, which I call like a voiceover in a film.
Yeah, explain it.
Well, imagine your voice, David, when I'm doing this, and suddenly a deep resonant voice comes up.
Hire me for the audiobook. I'm available.
Yeah, they've already done it, unfortunately, even better. I love the Audible version. I do. But every once in a while, we need to know things they can't know, right? And we'll pull the camera back and say, okay, what does this mean, right?
Yeah.
Now we've watched all this ourselves. But it's put in italics to remind us that nobody then knew it. One of the things I say, that nobody ever saw the Battle of Gettysburg.
Right.
Everybody saw a piece of it. Robert E. Lee George Meade never saw the Battle of Gettysburg, and nobody ever saw history. People saw, everybody is somewhere. They can see what they can see. So the trick is to use that limited knowledge not as a limitation, but actually as the enabling principle of the narrative.
And aren't you with these pages or two of italics appear often at the end of chapters or begin, but sometimes even in the middle.
Yep.
And isn't that where you're really rising above and saying, in part, why does this all matter to the whole country? Or the
Yeah,
world?
and you know, I imagine there will be graduate students who ever read this book will just eat the middle of the Oreo like that and eat read the italics. But part of what I was trying to do is I always hated books that you could just read the last two paragraphs of the chapter and you knew what it said. You remember I got in trouble and Promised the New South refusing to do that. People thought it was postmodern because I didn't have like summaries.
Summaries.
You know.
No, I hate summaries.
So
Poignant narrative ending, no summary.
yeah. So that's what I tried to do that as little as possible, but to still be the mortar of the book. I wanted the narrative to be self-supporting, self-sustaining. But the trick of it, the challenge, is I have not surprisingly, I mean, I really did luck out with all the black voices in the United States colored troops. I mean,
Amazing letters.
Yeah, they are. And they say...
And diaries even.
Yeah. But for the enslaved people of Augusta County, it's much more of a mosaic. It's much more of trying to make a quilt out of just these tiny fragments. And any glimpse or what we could piece together. So the trick there was to not let the central protagonist be left out.
Right.
And that's another reason it's useful to go into Emancipation. Those people burst into prominence and into eloquence. But I find the Freedmen's Bureau, I mean, I think this is a product of growing up in the new social history and the quantitative moment. I bet I could turn this Freedmen's Bureau record of marriages into an eloquent document. And so you can go back and you can see where everybody, both couples, had been born. And then you could see the span of slavery was across half the continent. Or you could see, or where their children might have been sold. Or where the Freedmen's Bureau wrote letters in search of other family members. So you can piece things together that way. So the trick was not to just because somebody was eloquent, let them hog the stage. Because you really got to figure out what's the main point here. If it's about slavery and war, and then about war and freedom, then African American people have to have as much of a voice as I can possibly find. You know, they did a dramatization of this in Richmond with 4 actors, 2 white, 2 black, 2 men, 2 women. It's you can see it. It's
the
online.
new book or the whole?
Yeah, the new book.
Really?
And it's really beautiful. And the one woman...
Is there video of it?
Yep. And the woman who portrays enslaved woman sort of weaves together these different moments, these different pieces into one character. And it's just... I had tears in my eyes watching it. But
talking about stealing the stage, try writing a biography of Douglass. Boy, anyway.
I hear that's being done.
By the way, election of 1864, the 64 election was so important to Douglass that once Lincoln wins, his metaphor for that moment was Noah's Ark and the end of the flood.
Now you tell me.
Yeah, well.
I would have liked to have had that. Thanks a lot. Volume 2.
I didn't find it till about a year.
Oh, but I did really learn from your work. Douglass says, and this is a paradox, or it's a problem. I checked it out with you, said it was true. The Republicans are working to create the 13th Amendment as soon as the election of 1864 is over, but in order to accomplish that, they don't talk about black people at all during the election of 1864.
And they don't want Douglass out campaigning for
Right, and Douglass says the Negro is like the deformed child that's put in the attic when visitors come. And if he hadn't said that, I think people would have been skeptical and to believe that the Republicans aren't just racist, but they're strategic in order to try to do this, but the electorate is so racist, they can't actually talk about what they're going to do.
Well, the 64 election, I always say, is the most racist election in American history until the next one.
Right.
68 was a little more, but
Right.
anyway. Probably my last question here. Having studied so deeply on the ground these two communities and realizing the savagery, the hatred, and the sheer scale of loss. if I'm remembering right, 69% of adult men in Augusta County are dead, wounded, or otherwise diseased. That's 69% at the end of a community are just gone at the end of the war. But the savagery, the hatred in these communities. How did a United States ever become in any way even resembling united after this? This is modern civil wars. We've come to see it around the world. They're burning each other's towns and villages. They're savaging each other.
For no really strategic gain. That's one of the things that the
you
burning
burn
of the
our
Shenandoah
village,
Valley
we'll
gains
burn
you
in your
nothing.
town. You burn that, we burn this. But it's how after, you know, and you do show here, and a lot of us have been arguing this for years, that Reconstruction is really the war by other means. You know, that the shooting war is over, but the war's not over. And it's not really over in this region either. Or, you know, anyway, how could they ever, you know, become, and the ex-Confederates keep saying, we are one people again, we are one people again, but it meant on their terms.
Yeah.
And they couldn't have that at first. So.
There's a whole lot of amnesia, purposeful and accidental. You know, there was one article said that I wrote an article back in 1996 called Worrying About the Civil War, an affectation for David Davis. And my argument was, I worry about it. Nobody's worrying about the Civil War. It was a terrible thing. But we're just like this, okay, it was a growth phase. And it's like, no, it was terrible. Nobody wanted it. Nobody intended for this to happen.
That's Ken Burns' influence.
Yes,
really
it was. But it was also in the scholarship as well. And then a review essay recently came out and said, starting with Ayers' essay, a new, darker vision of the Civil War has
You're responsible for the dark turn?
And everybody can see that I am just kind of the most morose person that you've ever seen. But I think that we had the same amnesia and nostalgia, which I certainly see lots of time. People come to me, I'm sure you've heard this, God, I love the Civil War. It's like,
I start my lecture course with that line.
I know what you mean. You love learning about it and making sense of it and so forth, but how can you love this? So the book is, you know, there was a review in the Wall Street Journal that was, said it was like a long funeral song, Adagio Guelzo,
Really?
that it was written, and it's elegiac. I'm okay with that, you know, that it's a really sad.
It's what needs to happen with monuments too.
Yeah, well, that's part of this.
We need some monuments that might try the elegiac mode.
Well,
without it, but it's hard to do
and
without
I'll build this a bridge in case people want to talk about that. But
okay, yeah,
often what I tell people.
That's your cue for monuments.
Okay, is that the most powerful monument that I've ever seen to the Civil War is in Richmond, in Hollywood Cemetery, and it's a pile of granite dragged up from the James in 1868, surrounded by 18,000 anonymous soldiers who've been brought to Richmond by train to die from all over the South.
It's just like a little pyramid of stones.
Well, it's not little. It's
a big pyramid of stones.
Yeah, it's really big. It's probably 60 feet tall.
Yeah,
and you look at it, and it just has one side on it, and that's what mourning should look like. But instead of that mourning, we have men on bronze horseback. So to answer your question, there's a lot of displacement by the South of the memory of this horrible mistake, this miscalculation, this arrogance that destroyed an entire generation of them and stripped away $1 trillion of their property as they imagined it, completely set them back 100 years in economic development. And instead they put up monuments to victory on the battlefield. So there's that. We know, because of your work, that there's also the displacement of African American aspiration and claims to American freedom. But here's the thing, is that without the opposition, so we talked before about the colossal suicide of world history, the Confederacy causes that. I believe that had the Confederacy not fought back so arrogantly in 1865 and 1866, There is no radical Reconstruction, and there is no 14th and 15th Amendment. If the white South had just said, we lost, okay, but instead they resisted with the riots in New Orleans and Memphis, and here's a place that is relatively quiet, but there's just violence in the air everywhere. So in the same way the Confederates bring emancipation, the former Confederates bring Reconstruction in conjunction with Northern Democrats. If the Republicans didn't feel that they were on the verge of losing everything the war had been fought for, they would not have implemented the 14th Amendment, which we see that just as Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, to the great crescendo. Instead, it's all counterpoint. It's all counterpunching. What? You're doing that after this defeat? You're still doing this? And so the book ends when Virginia comes back in the Union in 1870 with a new Constitution. Reconstruction's over. And most Reconstructions in most places are over by the early 1870s. Even though our textbooks turn in 1877, that's denouement. It's really over with by then. So how do they forget about it? Very purposefully, the North says, we won everything worth having in the country. We will determine monetary policy. We will build the railroads. You can have your statues. And you can have unchecked control over the African-American population of the South. And the South says, great, we'll take that bargain and live with the consequences. And
it's a slow bargain. It doesn't happen at once. It takes
and one of the sad
decades.
things, I'll end with this. It was a hero in the book is Alexander Mcclure, who's the head of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. He's a confidant of Lincoln. He helps Lincoln get elected in the first place. He writes all these eloquent editorials about the wrong of slavery and the capacity of black people. But when he writes his memoir in 1902, after he's moved to Philadelphia and become he says, Reconstruction, what a bad idea, disaster. Giving votes to Negroes should never have been done. And then the guy who ends Reconstruction in Virginia about the same time gives a speech and talks about how it was this fight against the great corruption. And they agree. So at Appomattox, where they slap each other in the back, say, hey, good game. Reconstruction, say, hey, sorry about that. Yeah, it's okay. We got what we
And
did.
the loss caused by that time had become a victory narrative.
Yeah.
A victory over Reconstruction.
Right.
Okay, well, let's open this up. Don't let me keep talking to Ed here.
You can't believe all that. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Steve, speak up. We are trying to tape it.
I have a couple on-the-ground questions. In both Franklin and Augusta, did it produce many soldiers for the opposing side? Also, was there any violence between Confederate and Northern or U.S. Followers within the two counties itself? And also, on the memorial question, in the end, what kind of memorials were put up within those two counties about the Civil War?
Yeah, great questions. No, to answer your first question, what's remarkable is that here you have this place where people are voting for the Union up to the last second. But as soon as Virginia secedes, they're full Confederates. And that's what's so remarkable. And I'm a little different than some other works who want to emphasize Confederate dissension. And that happens when the Union Army's not breathing down your neck. By and large, you can afford to dissent. Here, even though the most Unionist part of the county, this is part of the Lee thing, the greater the resistance you show to fighting and the greater submission you make to fighting, the greater your character must be. It must have been for some high virtue, right? So Augusta County is remarkably mobilized. Now, one of the cool things that sources I'm able to use are the Southern claims in the 1870s. And then the government comes down and says, if you were a supporter of the United States and we came and took some of your stuff, sorry, would you like to make a claim? And then all these people who had been invisible start coming up and saying, I was always a friend of the Union. I helped people desert. I was a friend. And then black people come and say, indeed, they were. And so there's a hidden resistance.
Nobody voted for Nixon either.
Yeah, that's right. But it's all hidden. And so what's remarkable, and that the
Can't
Northern
use that anymore. Nobody knows who Nixon was.
I got it. It's hilarious.
Okay.
The Northern Democrats pride themselves on being loyal soldiers. And they say it's the Republicans that are disloyal because they've changed the purpose for which we're fighting. So you don't really see, my story is really much more about this complete conversion experience that both sides have. And Jedediah Hotchkiss, one of my great characters.
He's your map guy.
Yeah, comes from upstate New York to Augusta County in 1854 for he and his wife and little girls create a school. And the war starts and the school goes away. So he goes up in the mountains to the west of Augusta County. That's the beginning of the Alleghenies where Stonewall Jackson happens to be, and says, hey, I know how to make maps. And Jackson says, great, we can use you. And he ends up being the map maker for Lee and Jackson for the rest of the war, and wrote letters home to Sarah every week about telling them what they thought. So there's a case. He owned one slave before the war, and his abolitionist mother back in New York says that's okay if you believe in your heart that it's God's will that you do this. So not only do you not find people fighting against each other, you find pre-war difference and resistance subsumed into this tribalism. Did I get most of your questions?
Yeah, that and what memorials.
Oh, in those
Yes,
two
the
towns,
memorial.
Yeah.
I tried, well, memorials of a form begin immediately. And I'll be self-indulgent here just for a moment. So I live in Charlottesville as well as in Richmond, and we were in Charlottesville on the day of the death there, and I was going to teach a class with my friend Brian Ballow, kind of a counter, to the alt-right people coming in, and my daughter, who's a filmmaker, was going to show a film about lynching, but we were watching on television before we went downtown, and we saw what everybody else saw. And then 2 days later, so the media comes and says, will you talk about this? And I'm trying to figure out, what's the legitimate thing. So I'm on this commission, I want to do the right thing. But I ended up being on PBS NewsHour, standing on the memorial site where Heather Heyer had been killed. And they said, where do these monuments come from? And I actually said, well, they were put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy as their fathers were dying. And because you just weren't hearing anything about that. And that doesn't, and then I said, in the process, they included the role of slavery. And so I was trying to thread the needle in the 90 seconds I had on national television live to...
I saw that. I thought, ooh, he needed another 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Was better than the 1 minute I had to explain what caused the Civil War for NBC Nightly News. But and I emphasize there, it's worth remembering in 1866 that they go around and digging up bones or finding them in ditches and behind people's barns of some anonymous boy and bring them together into a central cemetery, and all the tension that they'd felt for the last decade. Now the unity of all white Southerners coming together, and the children strewing flowers on the raw red clay graves, and interweaving Confederate songs and Christian hymns, and pastors giving sermons. It's another way they come together. That's the beginning of memorialization. It's Memorial Day. Black members of the same community are walking in the opposite direction. This is a mile-long procession. Black people of the same community are walking the other direction to put American flags on the graves of the Union soldiers who had died in Augusta County. Okay? So the things that we see being contested are contested from the very first day. And I already gave you the quote that the North had about Robert E. Lee. But it's almost like a minor note on all this. They can't agree in Chambersburg what the statue should look like. The women want a fountain. The men want a Confederate soldier. No, they want a Confederate soldier and a Union soldier handing a canteen to each other.
Really? At what year? What time?
1870s.
Oh.
Reconciliation already. So, yeah,
Why didn't I know that when I was writing Racing Reunion?
Knowledge advances, David, even without us. But finally they do raise the money, and it's a guy facing the south in front of a fountain. Augusta County takes a long time to raise the money, and now, as in Richmond, it's a century over all these anonymous graves around it, but not till much later. So it takes them a long time to do the monument thing, but Augusta and Staunton are unusual. There's a Robert E. Lee High School there and so forth now, but there's no statue at the courthouse or anything. It's in the cemetery where it's fitting. But Chambersburg, the strange thing there is that there's a plaque in the diamond, the town square, Here's where Robert E. Lee stood as he considered the raid on Gettysburg. But then they also have a giant tombstone-like thing that adds up the tally of the burning of Chambersburg in July of 1864. This is how much the property was destroyed and so forth. So it's that jumble of memories, and you can go there in summer, and they have at the centennial of it, they have a laser show that recreates the burning of Chambersburg. I've seen the video of it. I've not actually been there for that. So it just shows you how these memories are, but in both places, and I make a point of in saying this in the book, both places there are African American history tours that you can take where they uncover this history that had been buried. So all these things are not like sedimentary things or where we used to believe that, then we believe it. We believe all these things all the time, and they're all jumbled together. And I wrote a little piece about our current controversy, and I called it our silent civil war. These statues sit there like Victorian furniture in the middle of our cities all this time until suddenly they start talking to us, right? And so it's this kind of, all these things are held in suspension. And it's, my argument is, if we don't know anything about the war that they memorialize, how can we possibly figure out what the statue should do? And I find that people are eager to ignore all of that. And I'm going to drag them through all this stuff.
That's one of my 3 principles for how to manage monument removal or keeping them. No more history. That's a principle. Who's next? Yes, sir.
Could you say a word about the commonality that existed between the 3 states that might have elected McClellan but didn't? And secondly, what was the reaction in Franklin County to the Democratic platform?
The first answer is no. I don't know. I can't. That's not.
What are the 3? What are the 3
Ohio.
states? New Jersey.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We can
McClellan's from
name
New
all the. But no, I don't. I'm sorry. My notes will explain what they are, but I can't tell you. And it's really just one sentence in the book, because what is more important to realize is that every county in the North has a vital Democratic Party that's fighting on the ground with the Republicans. And that's the reason I celebrate the partisanship of the Republicans. They use the Democrats as a sharpening blade to clarify their own thinkings. The Democrats are all racism. It's all miscegenation. It's all, the Negroes are going to come up here and take our wives and all this sort of stuff. And the Republicans, in response, say, no, this is really about American freedom and democracy and all of these kinds of things. I think that the election of 1864 shows, unless they were forced to, they wouldn't put all their cards on the table in that way. So they end up following Lincoln, but then also pushing Lincoln. I mean, there are abolitionists who are writing petitions to Lincoln and Douglas. And so that the election on the ground is bitter in every single county. And if you want to kind of answer your question, if you want to figure out where the Democrats were strongest, it was from Connecticut to Illinois. And in that band, something like 48.7% of the voters vote for Abraham Lincoln. So really, the heart of the North, that's where it's so strong. So we'll pretend that that's kind of an answer to your first question. All right?
And on the Democrats, just a quick point, and you show this in some detail. They also did what current-day Republicans do, parallel. They will argue that emancipation is unconstitutional. They'll argue that the proclamation was unconstitutional because it's an executive order, but they'll even argue that emancipation is unconstitutional because they're property. You got Northern Democrats, so it's not an explicitly racist argument, but it's a constitutional argument.
Well,
about limited government and states' rights and property rights.
You have seen the Lincoln movie, and it seems so strange at the time. Of all the things about Abraham Lincoln, you're going to look at this passing of the 13th Amendment after the war is already over. What's all this and the political chicanery and all that? One of the main guys is from Franklin County. He stands up with his hands in his pockets and he says, "Yeah, I support the 13th Amendment." And it's what?
That's right. He whispers it.
Yeah. And so that I think that the Lincoln movie was brilliant. I see in retrospect to focus on that because if they don't pass that before the war is over, the Democrats could push just what you're saying, or the courts could undermine it. And that's back to your very first point, how all of this remains in play till the very end. And it's interesting how sometimes we have been focusing a lot on African Americans in the war, and I've heard people we know and like say slavery had been so damaged that it couldn't be put back together. But we need to remember 3 million enslaved people never came within reach of the United States Army.
Right.
And so the 13th Amendment...
Weren't freed until well after the war.
Exactly. So all of this politics, and I think it's a little bit weird to put the politics and the military and the social history in the same frame. That generally tends to be oil and water. It's interesting, actually. And it's because all these things are still hanging there because of politics. Oh, look at all the hands. Oh, this whole murderer's row over here.
Well, they get to go last.
Okay.
So I'm in the aforementioned Confederate experiment class now, and this week we read sort of the birth of the sort of lost cause reading from some ex-Confederate generals. And I was surprised at how, like you said, these people that had fought so hard for slavery, they immediately understood together as a unit that they had to treat it as an incident of the war and not the cause. And I was wondering your thoughts on that. How did they know that they had to make that pivot, and why did they make that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also interesting how much they don't say, that they recognize that slavery's gone, as an institution. It was surprising to me. They'll fight on every other front. But then, yeah, okay, you're right. Slavery's gone. We had the right to secede, and slavery's gone, but we're not saying it was wrong or anything else. It just is. I think...
like the weather, it went away.
Yeah, but part of this is, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Why did they think they had to make that move to distance themselves from slavery?
Defend slavery. Why did they suddenly wash their hands of it and switch to right?
Yeah. But so one of the things that you see is the white Southerners saying to themselves, "We will get what we need anyway." And they actually, and you see these things of, I don't need to take care of these old people anymore. I don't need to take care of this crippled guy. And the contracts they draw up instantly, and they say to, what they're really mad about, and I don't think anybody ever acknowledges this as much as I think they should, disfranchisement, what they're mad about is their own disfranchisement. They say, if you're going to enfranchise the Negroes, we can handle that. Okay? So they believe that they have the power, in which they very explicitly say, we run everything, we'll be able to control that. So there's a word, though, that I do think is actually, that I don't make up, but I discover in there that I think is actually better than lost cause, which is rebelism.
Yeah, that's a chapter title.
Yeah, the Republicans say, they come and have these hearings, kind of, again, not unlike today, and they make these people come in, and include Robert E. Lee's one of them, tell us what is the state of the South today. And what they say is, what we're doing, we cannot believe how much rebelism is still in the South. You guys lost everything. How can you be so...
Start that movement, replacing it with rebelism.
Yeah.
Good luck.
I might do that. But, so, they do it as a strategic retreat. Okay, we can't get slavery back. It's not going to come. So let's take what we need out of the current order. We're not going to make a big deal out of that. And one reason Augusta, I don't believe everybody, all white Southerners were just fine with black people voting. It's like in Augusta County, it's 3/4 white, which is the average for the South as a whole. Augusta County is typical of the South as a whole. And they say, if we are men, there's no way the black people should be able to dominate us. So there's partly that calculation, and it's the case. Within a few years, they get almost all the control back in their hands. Okay.
Oh, we got murderer's row over here.
Yeah.
Joe, you go first.
Thanks. On those Southern Unions in Augusta County, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about their conversion. One assumes that it has everything to do with their attachment to slavery, but if you could focus on their unionism and what happens to it after they make that fateful decision. Other people have written about this, but at a very broad level. But what's so fascinating about this is that you pick these very specific group of people and you follow them. So if you could just share with us that conversion process.
Well, the great crisis of Reconstruction is at the first opportunity, these former Confederates elect the same people to represent them who had just been leading the Confederacy a few months earlier. And that's another case where it's the white South that's pushing Reconstruction. And it's like, well, these are our best guys. You know, they're the most educated, they're the most committed to the public good. They were sacrificing at every step, even though we know they voted against secession. Look at them. They are, it's just like Robert E. Lee. He didn't want to, you forced him into it. And what they did, and so they do remain civic leaders all the way through. And what they say is that we are embodying the collective aspirations of our community. Okay? So they're all slaveholders, and they all believe in slavery. But it's like, you know, I'm often asked, you know, told, the slavery it couldn't have been about slavery, Ed. 3/4 of white Southerners didn't own slaves. And I point out, it's true. If you read their letters, they're not saying, I can't wait to go die, Mom, for slavery. And they don't yell, yay, enslavement, when they're marching into battle. But what I say, they're dying for a nation based on slavery. Okay? And if you don't have that space in between, there's no locus for patriotism and sacrifice for your mom and all that, right? So these unionists are saying, we believe in exactly the same thing. They don't change a single belief that they have. They said, we're just minding our own business. We believe in the Bible and the Constitution. We helped write this we wrote this Constitution, you Yankees, the Declaration of Independence. None of our values have changed. You're the ones who've changed. So unionists doesn't really require anything other than believing that the other side has betrayed the United States, its highest ideals. And that's Lincoln's, what he can't really anticipate, is that he sees it as rebellion and treason. They see it as defense of the very same ideals. I mean, as you know, the symbol of the Confederacy is George Washington. They believe that that they've not changed at all. And that's how they come back out the other side and say, okay, these things have changed, but we still believe in the same thing, which is local control, the Constitution. We think what you're doing is unconstitutional, but okay, we recognize that we'll have these new constitutions and we'll write new ones. And we're being very consistent. So what looks to us like this huge sea change from their point of view is actually, it's not me, it's you. Okay?
Go ahead, Josh. Josh. And then Ben.
On the topic of partisanship,
Yeah.
you said one of the beauties of putting these two counties together was that there's like similar people in all respects except for slavery. So if we look just at Franklin County, these are even more similar people, even more geographically contiguous, yet there is that visceral partisanship. So what, it's not slavery, what is the sticking point? How does the same region, is Lancaster in Franklin County?
No.
That's a little,
It's nearby, but the same region gives us Thaddeus Stevens, but also James Buchanan. How
Yeah.
do we have them so
Buchanan is born in Franklin County, and Thaddeus Stevens has his ironworks in Franklin County, right? And so he's
everybody.
What's the question?
is,
I'm sorry, I started talking and realized I didn't know what I was going to answer.
we're looking at the local level like this.
Yeah.
Can that explain what makes a Democrat, what makes a Republican? What's the difference?
You know, I've studied that very carefully, and the answer is no, which is true on every level. Historians have not been able to find correlates that explain this very well. Now, what we know in the countryside, right? We know that Irish were Democrats and Protestants were Republicans by and large. But we know, I can take you down to a very granular level in all the different districts and so forth. Mainly, the strongest determinant of how you vote was how your father voted. And that it is, things are so personal. So you get the voter turnout from some of these precincts, it's 184 to 115, right? And you look at that and you think, okay, well, that's tied into who goes to church with whom and who's next to the store and whose daughter got married and all that, which is one reason they hate each other so much, is that they're throwing rocks through each other's windows, cutting the reins on horses at the meetings and so forth. And that's the reason my vision of all this is a fractal in which it's the same at every level, right? Whether it's the district or the county or the congressional district or the state or the nation, you've got two parties that are fighting each other, guerrilla warfare at every step along the way. And so it feeds the hatred so much. Now here's something I'll be curious to see what people think about. Alexander Mcclure goes to Lincoln, says, "Sir, I'm afraid you're going to lose Pennsylvania. Here's something you could do. You could bring 5,000 soldiers home from Sheridan's army, and they could vote."
Pennsylvania didn't let them vote at the front?
They voted at the front too,
Oh, okay.
but there's the army vote, and then there's the home vote, they call.
Yeah.
By just bringing the soldiers home, they can win the home vote. And they do. Is that cheating? I don't know. It was Abraham Lincoln's. Looks good to me. But also the army vote, it's only
Lock him up.
in 1864, the 1864 that the soldiers in the field vote, and it's 19 states permit that. And there too, you can see one unit to the other could be Democrat or Republican, right? Even though from the Democrats' point of view, Republicans are driving them crazy because they use the word loyal for just them. And they say, we're just as loyal as you are, you know, but the Republicans are able to get that. So here's what I believe, is that if you understand that this is at this highly granular level, we wouldn't expect to be the kind of statistical correlates of this is the kind of people who voted for. You know, there's been great work on all this. Basically, what we see is the people most highly mobilized to vote were young men. So the men who died were the ones who most likely voted for Breckinridge in the South and Lincoln in the North. And the wide awakes, there's some great scenes in that of the wide awakes coming in and mobilizing. So it's generational as well. So that's, I think, just recovering the texture of local politics, I think makes it comprehensible to me in a way that it wasn't before.
But the Democrats in Franklin County are dead against abolition too, though.
Yeah.
And so there is the slavery issue that
Yes, I'm
about
sorry.
How,
I was just
maybe about
answering-
how your daddy voted, but it's also, I mean, they're vehemently against
But you know, and
abolition.
they are. But here's something that we see, and certainly something we're seeing today. Partisanship often comes first. You are a Democrat before you have an opinion about emancipation. Okay? And so we're imagining, and nobody changes
My
their
Holt's gonna like this.
nobody changes their vote. Okay? So it's like today. What do we think about Roy Moore? It depends if you're a Republican beforehand, right? It's not the data, it's actually the prism that you're viewing it through. And so that's what I believe, David, is that it is not so much that emancipation is that people choose a party because of what they, now you would have chosen Republicans because you wanted to stop slavery, right? But chances are it's because you're a former Whig and you believed in progress and all these kinds of things. I wish I had a more convenient answer. I would have written a shorter book.
Ben, next to last question.
Yeah, this might be a big question, but so if the fall of Atlanta and the election of 1864 is this turning point, what does that do with how we think about Reconstruction and how Reconstruction is dated? Does that mean we might think about Sherman's March and then the Petersburg campaign as an opening salvo of Reconstruction or Reconstruction policy?
It is, one of the things I really want to do is to show how much the war bleeds into Reconstruction, literally. I don't think we understand, we can see it's still the shadow of Vietnam today, right? Imagine what it would have been 18 months after the Civil War, and you're trying to come back. So a large part of this, some of the most powerful parts of the book are what seems to us now we know was just the needless death in the winter of 1864 and 1865. I got these heartbreaking letters of, I won't tell you, but they're really, I really get choked up reading them every time about a man who's so ready to come home, and then 2 weeks before he does, he dies. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I don't think that the policies toward Reconstruction begin in Chambersburg or the Sherman's March or any of that, because Lincoln's last words, this is a paraphrase, "I'll get back to you on Reconstruction," really his very last speech. "On this subject, I shall have more to say at some further point." And
I don't know what to do yet.
and he doesn't know. And so Johnson, when he comes in, says, I'm doing what Lincoln would have done. I'm trying to put the country back together again by appealing to these good people on both sides. He says, we need to preserve their manhood, right? By which he means I can't humiliate them. I've got to have the Alexander Stewarts and the John Brown Baldwins. I've got to have them believe in reunification and belong to a new national party that will really hold the country together. Otherwise, we'll have this country that's divided in that way. So I point out, I think of the things that people don't know about this period, the fact that there's 2 years between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of military Reconstruction, because everybody sees all the Yankees there and Gone with the Wind. We just know that's the same thing, right? But it's the remobilization is a remarkable thing that happens in between. So you're right in that I want the carnage of the war to be there underneath everybody's feet in Reconstruction. But I think we have to recognize the great breaks and disjunctions in the actual policy making.
It's been a parlor game among my graduate students in recent years to decide, all right, when did Reconstruction end? It's fun. Maybe we now have to switch it to when did Reconstruction begin?
Well, I'm vulnerable on this front. I'll just go ahead and say it here. Because Valley of the Shadow ended in 1870, and the 15th Amendment's passed in 1870, and Virginia re-enters the Union in 1870.
Very convenient.
It is very convenient. That's the reason I'm pointing it out before others can point it out for me. But I say that all the ideas and creative energy of Reconstruction had been expended by then. From now on, it's the clock running down, which is not the way that people see it. We've been talking about the long Reconstruction, the Reconstruction that goes to California. I'm sorry, I think it's actually in the South about slavery, and that is by the 15th Amendment, the Republicans have done what they can do. And the phrase that I use is they run out of electoral fuel. It's not that they run out of idealism. They can't win anymore on Reconstruction, and they don't have
They're
to.
going to lose the Congress by 1874.
Exactly. So, yes, hi.
I have a question about teaching.
Yeah.
With your books and with Valley of the Shadow project, you provided a rich trove of material for your students to teach historical contingency.
Right.
I wonder if you have any advice about how you do that. And are there any particular assignments or exercises in class that you think are particularly effective at helping students to really live in the moment and not see the future, not see that inevitable outcome?
Yeah, I think, thank you. I'm teaching a class right now for freshmen at Richmond, and we are, and I did it again in the fall before, we are, people know Chronicling America perhaps, with 19th century American newspapers, Library of Congress has gathered all this, but they're not as useful as they could be. So we have the students go in, and each of them owns a year of the newspaper, and their job is to find all the key articles, write a one-sentence summary, which turns out to be one of the best ways to learn to write that I've ever seen, trying to write a one-sentence summary of all these things. And they just come in wide-eyed but people don't know how this is going to turn out. Can you believe they're saying this? And I said, yes, I know. The Valley of Shadow is built in the same way, kind of like what I made David do down at Richmond. You can't know what happens later, okay? You can't say anything that they could not see at the time. So have it anchored in a moment. And so what could they, so here's a remarkable example, just leaps to mind. Everybody thinks it's awesome that Andrew Johnson is there after Lincoln's assassination. The Democrats and Republicans go, well, that was a close call. I'm glad we got this great guy. And the Democrats say, because he's a former Democrat, and Republicans say, he ran with Abraham Lincoln, right? I think if the students would come in and just sort of, because everybody knows.
It didn't work out.
Yeah, that Andrew Johnson was so terrible. To go back and say, the assignment is, tell me, what do people think about Andrew Johnson up on Lincoln? So that would be cool. So it's the constant element of surprise about all this is the way that I would do it. But, and we're doing the black newspaper in Richmond, the Richmond Planet from 1894 to 1909. And the students are completely, I mean, it's heartbreaking, just one article after another about lynching and all this, right? But the students are watching, you have an article about lynching and an article about self-improvement and new black businesses. Because I asked them, what do you know about African-American life between the end of Reconstruction and World War II? W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington didn't get along. That's really kind of what we know. And here in this one newspaper, you can see them combining all these different kind of things. And I tell them, you are making, so they're 19 years old, you're making this for yourself 2 years ago when you were taking AP US history. What do you want people to know about Black America in this time? And so rather than just telling them, it's contingent, damn it, you kind of have to have them discover it for themselves. I discovered it
It's like
here.
telling them to be creative.
Yeah, well, I mean, I discovered, my moment in all this was in Sterling Library when I read a newspaper on microfilm. And I discovered two things. One, all this stuff is happening at the same time. And B, nobody knows how it's going to turn out. You might have thought by the time I was in graduate school I would have known that, but I didn't. And in many ways, the Valley of the Shadow is a machine to recreate that moment. That all this stuff is happening at the same time, and nobody knows how it's going to turn out. But it's still our responsibility to find the patterns in it. This is not like, it's chaos. No, it's not. But the patterns are more intricate and more contingent than we thought. But that doesn't mean they're less powerful or important. I think, often I'll end with this comment. I'll answer as many questions as people want, but about the teaching part, what's the point of all this and of this emphasis? To tell these 19-year-olds far worse things than you can imagine can come out of history at any moment. All the elements that we need for something terrible to happen are there right now.
Charlottesville.
And other examples. Or even elections, say, right? In which all, more structural,
November 8th.
okay, they're there. And the fact that nobody saw that coming as it unfolded is a good example of that. But far better things than we can imagine can also happen. Now, I grew up in the segregated South. I watched the civil rights movement transform communities. And I can tell you certainly nobody in my house saw it coming or wanted it. But you can see it happen. So the point of all this is not to submit to nihilism or a sense of chaos, but rather a possibility. That I give the white North as a whole a hard time, but I actually like the good guys a whole lot. Because they're up against half the northern population, and Abraham Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens and these people still make good things happen. So the point of all this, if you look at these moments of contingency, it shows that you can make a difference too. That history is there for the shaping. So that's kind of the larger pedagogical point that I try to make with all this.
And you end on this whole idea that the past is always living, and you turn it into a hopeful idea. However,
Almost as if it's the thin light to freedom.
a thin light of freedom, yeah. Connor, can you maybe save your question for dinner? But I have a little thing I want to end with here, and it's sort of a question, Ed.
Okay.
And it's just what you were referring to about growing up in the South and how history's still living. This afternoon, in the same 5-minute period, one came at 2:14 p.m. and one came at 2:18 p.m., I got emails. And we all get you get these every day. I get them almost every day. From 2 white Southerners. Now, the good one first. It's this woman named Pamela Quillen. I think she lives in North Texas, but I won't read it all, but it's a long one, and it explains how her family's been 400 years in the South. She grew up believing that her ancestors never had anything to do with slavery until she actually did a little research. Turns out her family owned dozens and dozens of slaves. She now has learned that she too is part of the responsibility for all of this. And she's been watching my lecture course, and now she knows something about Reconstruction, I guess. But then she ends by saying that I see it all differently now. Then she says, when I grew up in Louisiana, the South was still mostly Democratic. Now we can get a sense of her age. When I turned 18, my mother had me register as a Democrat. It was a family practice. I watched the South gradually go Republican in the 80s and 90s, but I don't understand why. What books do you recommend your students to read about that? I mean, we don't have to say what we're going to have her read, but how did the South become Republican? She's still wondering why. Well, I don't know if I'll answer that one. But then the second one I got, I mean, you love these because somebody is learning and growing, and there are many Souths. Nobody needs to tell you that. But here's one from Whit Perry. He doesn't say where he's from. To me. You undoubtedly do not know your history. The Southerner was never a traitor. To be frank, he was sick of the Northern bullshit, just as we are today. I thank God every day that I was born a Southerner. We love our Confederate ancestors as they were always, as they were and always will be our heroes. Long live Dixie, Whit Perry. So, in the course of 5 minutes this afternoon, these two extremes, they're still there. But they're people growing, learning that history is complicated and messy, and oh, my family too owned slaves, and I need to know more. And then there's this guy who's just frozen, you know.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I've stayed in the South partly to help.
Yeah, well, I know you have.
To wrestle with this. I find that, okay, what language could persuade Mr. Perry to change his mind about anything, right?
Mm.
And so you've heard me deploy a few of my little things. Well, okay, yeah, that's true, but what if they'd won?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And because I don't hear anybody defending slavery, okay? So you start with that. Okay, slavery is bad, okay? So let's think about, okay, well, if slavery is kind of, and I agree, and I have phrases like this. In the same way I said that the white Confederate soldiers didn't fight for slavery, they fight for a nation based on slavery.
Mm.
You're right. The North did not go to war to end slavery, but the South did go to war to defend it.
Mm.
Okay? It's not a balanced equation. If you're just looking, and everybody wants to take away somebody's virtue to give it to somebody else, but it doesn't work this way.
Right.
So you try to find ways, and I'm out on the trail now, talking with groups that invite me to come talk about the monuments. And I say, listen, I'm a civil servant right now. I'm just on this commission. My job is not to come tell you what I think. Okay? I'm come to listen. But whatever you say, I will argue with. Go ahead and make any argument you want, and I will tell you why it's wrong. And my joke is that I've spoken at every faith community in Richmond, including the Country Club of Virginia, to do that. And it's freeing because
They have a deep theology.
it's not really me, right? It's just, but I can say things, like I, at one of these talks, and an older African-American woman came up to me, and she says, Dr. Ayers, when we were children, they would take us to these statues, and they'd point up to them and said, these are for us. These mean stay in your place, be quiet. And I say this to groups of good-hearted white people, and you just sort of see them just kind of like, this is not just Black Lives Matter that's saying this. This is actually people that we've lived with, and that was 40 years ago. They were saying that. So I don't believe that there's any op-ed that we can write that's going to change anybody's mind. And in some ways, the same way that the ideas follow events, whatever's going to happen with the monuments are going to happen, and ideas will follow. I mean, I've watched the Civil Rights Movement. I watch people I know learn a new vocabulary to change and things. So I think that it's contingent. Here's a moment because of Charlottesville. Nobody would have predicted. Like I said, I'm in both places. Who would have thought that Charlottesville, with 2 Confederate monuments, actually 3, would have the crisis, whereas Richmond, which is just laden with all these, would not, right? That's something you can't predict. But, okay, everybody's chastened. What did we just stopped our conversation in Richmond for 3 months to let people calm down.
Is that right?
Just
don't talk right now.
A small group came from Tennessee, really with 1 truck, and it cost us $500,000
Security
to kind of
for 1 truck.
Yeah. Well, because you can't tell what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you watch Charlottesville, and you watch, should have been more police presence and so forth. So I think that there's something I tell people all the time in Richmond. There's no way through this except through it. You cannot bypass history. We have to go through the history. We have to talk about what the history actually was. And this is the progress we've made on the slave trade in Richmond. We will be building a museum, memorial, or park. Money's already set aside for it, that you'll be able to see the domestic slave trade in Richmond.
Which was a big deal.
400,000 people.
Big deal.
But you can't see anywhere else in the United States. It's not as if the South is behind somebody else who's done this. So I will leave you with this vision that I have of what we can do about all this. We'd like for our whole city to be a place of remembrance. That you can go to see the place where the largest number of enslaved people, and it ends up being 1 million, who are moved from the eastern South to the western. The Lumpkins Jail, where Anthony Burns is actually imprisoned, and will recreate, and it's huge. You remember that when Charles Dew at our thing in Richmond, audible gasp. He showed one page of one account book from one slave trader in 1859 and showed that he did $2.5 million worth of business in 1859 dollars. And people were stopping in the hallways. I had no idea. Facts matter. History matters. Getting evidence in front of people matter. The way that you do it.
Money and numbers get people's attention.
Exactly. They can translate. So you come to Richmond, you'll be able to visit Shockoe Bottom, where the slave trade's located. Then you'll be able to go to this American Civil War Museum that Dave was talking about, which is under construction and will be done by 2019. And my animating vision for all this is school buses of fourth graders pulling up every day, telling the story of the Civil, and you'll walk in, and the first thing you'll be in is an experienced theater. You'll be in the burning of Richmond in April 1865. And you'll see the full cast of characters, men and women and black and white and Union soldiers. And it'll be like overwhelming, and it ends with, how did this happen? Then you'll go into the museum and take you in to explain all that. Then I think that we will interpret Monument Avenue at the very least about what this is. This is a Confederate.
Are you anticipating the monuments are likely to stay and get interpreted, or you can't show your hand yet?
No, we have to run through the law,
Right.
through the city council,
Right.
through the General Assembly, and it maybe, I don't know if you follow the Virginia elections, it was a 2/3 Republican, and now it might be majority Democrat. Talk about nobody again sees this. That's going to change all this. So the goal is, if you're on the commission, is to have a healthy, honest conversation, which everybody feels that they've been heard. And we had one big meeting of 500 people, in which people came and gave speeches, and they were not supposed to bring in signs, but some guys did, and these are some of my favorites. I'll end with this because this reminds us that history matters. Had these signs that said, because our original charge from the mayor, we have this young, charismatic, young African-American mayor who gave a speech, I hate these statues. I wish they weren't there. Here's this commission, do what you can. We're not going to put removal on the table because it's not clear that we can. After Charlottesville, he called us together and said, it's on the table now. You may wrestle with this. We still don't know what can be done. But before Charlottesville, adding context was seen as a bold move.
Yeah, that's right.
And then suddenly,
It was a
after
radical
Charlottesville,
move.
right,
Put a plaque on Lee.
and so these guys walked up and they had these signs that said, no context, no compromise.
Ooh.
Right? So it's kind of like
Good
climate denial. I don't want to know anything. So I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Go ahead.
So the point being is that they recognize that knowing things, to hear what people actually said when the statues went up, and to hear what people said against them from the moment they were put up, not that this is some later thing, changes everything about them. So I told the mayor, I don't like contextualization, which sounds mamby-pamby academic. We're just explaining the statues, right? So we'll at least do that. I will just point out that everybody seems ready to throw Jefferson Davis under the bus because he's either not from around here, he can go down to Mississippi, or he's the most
buried there.
You know, he's buried in Hollywood Cemetery, right? Or he's he lived the longest and was the strongest proponent of this idea that had nothing to do about slavery and it's constitutional. So we'll see what happens. But the whole idea is, let's pull the camera back, think about all of this, at the enormous suffering of slavery that underlay all of this. 14 Congressional Medal of Honor winners of the United States colored troops 5 miles outside of Richmond. Black troops come in and put out the fires that the Confederates set. If people know that, right, then things look differently. So we need not less history, but more history told honestly. So that's my sermon for the day. You folks have been very patient. Thank you so much for having me at Yale.